Hello, everybody. Welcome to TSAM Daily. I've got Nicolas Firzli here with me. Hello, Nick. How are you?
Bonjour, Anam. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you very much. How about yourself?
Surviving under these draconian lockdown measures.
Yeah. So is everybody. Nick, could you give a brief introduction to our audience about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Nicolas Firzli. I'm the Director General of the World Pensions Council, which is a Paris-based think tank and international association of long-term asset owners, mostly public and private pension funds.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick. Nick, I remember, it's been almost 7 weeks since TSAM London and since you last spoke at TSAM London. I remember you telling us that on the onset of the crisis, that governments around the world will put place swear lockdowns that would probably destabilize financial markets and the world economy, etc. Prophetic saying indeed. But taking a step back and considering the bigger picture here, can you please remind our viewers the antecedents that led us to this terrible crisis? Tell us, what exactly do you think went wrong?
Well, I think many things went wrong, and I was delighted to join you guys at the Summit on Asset Management, TSAM, in the City of London. You're right, 7 weeks ago. Time flies, and it was really the beginning, interesting timing, because it was really the beginning of the crisis. And of course, they haven't had that many conferences in the past 7 weeks because of the lockdown. So yeah, why was I, as you mentioned, why was I fairly pessimistic back then? Because I would argue, I have argued and I would argue even more now, that there were many pent-up dysfunctions. It's like, you say in Greco-Roman medical science, and the inventor of what we call, medical science was a chap named Hippocrates, and his disciples were Greeks and then Romans. And so in ancient Greco-Roman philosophy and biology and medical science, you speak about ex nihilo. So what does it mean? So ex nihilo is when a microbe or a virus or a germ appears out of nowhere, ex nihilo. Mm-hmm. And what the Greeks and the Romans figured out long before us, and in many ways they were much smarter than our policymakers today, they figured out that these cases of ex nihilo problems, that come out of the blue, so a microbe or a policy issue or an economic crisis that comes out of the blue, in most instances, it's fiction. In the real world of biology or physics or economics, it rarely happens, this ex nihilo thing. So what the Greeks and the Romans teach us is that in most instances, the illness is there in a subdued way earlier. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what happened with the so-called, coronavirus recession. We had many problems earlier, and I think we didn't realize that they were there. And so what happened, in my opinion, is that we had these pent-up issues. So you may call them, pent-up problems, pent-up microbes, whatever, mm-hmm. that were there in the economy, within financial markets, within the way corporations and governments operate. And these problems were there for a very long time, mounting, building up invisibly. Mm-hmm. But I was not the only one who raised the alarm. So others certainly raised the alarms, and I want to give credit where credit is due. So Ray Dalio was a very famous Italian-American hedge fund manager. He's also sort of an intellectual, very smart man. So Ray Dalio, in the last few weeks and months of 2019, raised the alarms. We did so at the World Pensions Council, we gave several interviews in the second semester and the last quarter of 2019, raising the alarm bells and saying, something big is coming, be careful. It was even before there was any talk of coronavirus. And of course, another chap who was a longtime professor of geoeconomics and economic strategy at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., Professor Edward Luttwak, he has also raised the alarms for many years. So to make a long story short, one of the alarming problems was the economic and financial short-termism.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really a big problem. And I think we may come back to that later. Another problem is over-leveraging. So there was too much cheap loans, too many cheap loans. So really complacency from the part of banks, but also complacency from the part of regulators and governments, a lot of cheap money floating around, and so too much leveraging. So, and policymakers, the governments themselves, were too much in debt before the crisis. Most companies, most corporations were also too much in debt long before the crisis, not only in emerging markets, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, investment banks in the City of London and Wall Street and the world over were lending too much money too easily to governments and corporations before the crisis. So that was really poison in the system. And another problem, I just, conclude on that, is what I call monetary complacency. Mm-hmm. And here I'm going to lay the blame, as I did at the TSAM conference in London 7 weeks ago. I'm going to do it again now. I'm going to lay the blame squarely at the doorstep of central bankers mm-hmm. and the governors of central banks, whose independence is becoming now more and more fictional, but it was already the case before the crisis. So they're not doing their job. And that's a big, big problem. And so what does it mean, monetary complacency? It's a policy. It's a criminal complacency in many ways, a very dangerous kind of complacency that most central bankers have engaged in for the past 11 or 12 years. So, right after what people call the great financial crisis mm-hmm. of 2008, 2009, 2010, most central banks progressively moved into a policy mindset called quantitative easing, mm-hmm. which is a fancy word, which in essence means, printing money and hiding it. So printing money on the cheap and hiding it. And they've been doing it under pressure from the governments. Okay. So I'm not saying it's only the fault of these poor central bankers, but still, they've been engaging in these highly dangerous quantitative easing policies. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean? Keeping interest rates at artificially low levels mm-hmm. for abnormally long periods of time. So you really keep them very low, artificially low, for abnormally long periods of time. So what was supposed to be a policy fix to resolve the great financial crisis of 10, 11, 12 years ago became a drug, mm-hmm. basically. And the whole economic system became hooked up on that very dangerous, toxic drug. And, the economic situation in Britain and America improved from 2012 onward. Mm-hmm. The economic situation in mainland Europe and the rest of the world improved from 2014 onward. So these guys, they've had 5, 6, 7 years of relatively good economic circumstances. They could have stopped progressively, or they could have tried progressively to stop engaging in these foolish quantitative easing practices, and they haven't. Mm-hmm. And now we're paying a big, big price for that, sadly.
For sure. And do you think because the people that you mentioned that had warned the industry around that there's another financial crisis due because of these practices, do you think the industry didn't hear what they were saying or didn't understand what they were saying?
I think it's a very complicated issue. So it's not only, the Pandora's warning, the blind, whatever, investors and policymakers. It goes deeper than this. So and the issues and the problems that we are facing go deeper than the 3 or 4 factors mm-hmm. that I've mentioned. Mm-hmm. And I think we may come back to that, because I think you mentioned other topics that you wanted to raise, or issues that you wanted to raise today. And I think we can start answering them in the course of these questions. But, to make a long story short, yes, there are many problems. But it's fairly complicated. And I think what the crisis did, it magnified them. Mm-hmm. So what the crisis did is it puts the magnifying lens on some pre-existing, problems. And in a way, of course, the crisis is terrible. It's having, terrible economic consequences across, emerging markets, but also in the developed world. And, unemployment rates are getting, very quickly spiking up to very high levels. So of course, it's having effect in the real world, and very terrible negative effect. But I'd like to be mildly and cautiously optimistic. So the flip side of these negative effects is maybe people, will open up their eyes, realize that they need to change. So I think, I'm cautiously optimistic, and I think, some changes will happen hopefully in the coming weeks.
For sure, for sure. And I remember, Nick, when we met in March in the city at TSAM, the prices for oil as measured by WTI index was at that point in time $41 a barrel. And you were very, very bearish back then. Today it's around $12. It's approximately 70% drop in just 7 weeks. Is it really due to the Saudi-Russian rivalry, or do you think it's the slowdown of the world economy that's causing it?
Very good question and very good point. And for short, no. So I don't want to spend too much time on that topic because it's typically the kind of, not shallow issue, but it's a kind of issue upon which the media and the politicians will focus. Oh my God, there is a terrible Russian-Saudi rivalry. It's crazy. It's getting out of hand. The sky is falling. So in part, it's true to a certain limited extent, but to a large measure, it is not important. It's exaggerated, and the media circus and the politicians are exaggerating. So for short, no, it's not only because of the, Saudi-Russian rivalry or the current, whatever enmity between, His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman and President Putin, or, this has very little to do with the price of oil. And to make a long story short, it's a reflection of some very much bigger and broader macroeconomic, financial, and industrial and geoeconomic trends that are reshaping the world economy. And once again, these trends pre-existed the crisis, and the crisis only magnified and perhaps accelerated them a little bit. But I'm afraid it goes much deeper and it's much broader than the theatrical, OPEC Russian rivalry that made it to the front page of the financial press for the past 6-7 weeks.
And now that we're hearing a lot about, geoeconomics, everything, we are also hearing an increasing number of members of Trump administration and of Australian government, and even some of the MPs in the UK criticizing the World Health Organization, or they're blaming China for all of this. Some politicians even go so far to call it the Wuhan virus. Why such rhetorical violence now? Do you think it's the beginning of a new Cold War, pitting Washington against Beijing? And if so, how can institutional investors be prepared and hopefully adjust to it?
It's a very good question, and yes. I think you put your finger on the most important issue here. And once again, let's beware of the theater. So really, it's not something recent. So most so-called experts are blaming it all on President Trump or on Chairman Xi Jinping in Beijing. And as you can see in that beautiful chart here, these trends pre-existed the crisis. So really, you have I think it's a slide that I used in London 7 weeks ago, and you have here on the left-hand side Tuco, who's a character from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And in a way, Tuco is the symbol of that new age of ultra-realism, which Professor Ludwig calls the age of geoeconomics, right? And of course, people may call it, a very cynical age. I don't think so. I think it's just realism. So what does it mean? It means viewing the world as it is, right? So, some people don't like the World Health Organization because they think it's close to China. Some people don't like the Chinese government because they think it's whatever, not democratic enough or too centralized. On the other hand, some people, don't like the US model because they think it's too capitalist or too whatever, greedy or whatever, All these moral labels are completely and highly uninteresting. So basically, and this is really the Edward Luttwak realist worldview, or in France, we call it, the Richelieu Mazarin worldview. And in Italy, they may call it the Machiavellian worldview. So it's, what does it mean? If you're a realist, you don't try to judge governments or the CEOs of companies purely using, moral yardsticks. Mm-hmm. It is the recipe for disaster. So, if you're a financial journalist, you're listening to the CEO of a large listed company in the London Stock Exchange. If you're a policy analyst, you're listening to President Trump or to Chairman Xi Jinping. If you start using moralistic labels, it's not good, doesn't work. So being a realist is just seeing the world as it is. Mm-hmm. And the rise of China, of course, it didn't happen yesterday. Mm-hmm. It has been happening for the past 25 years, slowly but surely. And maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was an acceleration in the relative rise or the relative importance of China on the world stage, both in terms of, economic mass and political influence. And maybe in the past 12 or 9 months, the acceleration accelerated, right? Mm-hmm. And so now with the Corona crisis, people are saying, oh my God, there is a new Cold War between Beijing and Washington. It's really bad, it's horrible. Why can't we just hug each other and love each other, right? So these people are imbeciles. So in the real world, it doesn't work that way. So we don't need to judge the White House using pseudo-moralistic, yardstick, and we don't need to criticize the Chinese government because we don't like the way their policy making is organized internally. It's their problem, not ours. Mm-hmm. So as rational analysts, we need to view the world in a cold, Cartesian, rational way. So of course, that rise of China has an impact on the standing of Europe and the US. Mm-hmm. That rise of China has a profound impact on emerging markets across the greater Eurasian continuum. And the greater Eurasian continuum really starts in Manchester or Dublin and stretches to Tokyo. Mm-hmm. And this is really the playground for China's ambitions. It's neither good nor bad. It is a reality, right? So every time, there are Chinese investors, including Chinese sovereign funds and Chinese state-owned banks, every time, the management of Chinese state-owned banks or Chinese civil engineering companies, they fly to, Trieste or Napoli or Athens, mm-hmm. You have some idiots panicking in Berlin or Brussels saying, oh my God, Chinese are coming, they're taking over Europe's, ports. Or this is really shallow and stupid. They're not coming to take over Europe's ports. It's a natural geo-economic development. And if there are peoples in Brussels or Berlin who are maybe unhappy about that, they shouldn't say, oh my God, and lecture us. Perhaps they should give more money to the Italians and the Greeks. So perhaps if the EU or the Germans gave more financial and economic resources to people in Trieste, Napoli, or Athens, they wouldn't need to call upon Chinese state-owned civil engineering and contracting firms. So, so what I mean is these are natural developments, and they have to be realized and acted upon in a rational way. And so from that perspective, I'll just, conclude on that. From that perspective, basically, ironically, even though they look like rivals, even though they seem to be rivals or so-called enemies, in many ways, President Trump and Chairman Xi Jinping, they speak the same language. It's the language of Professor Ludwig. It's an ultra-realist geo-economic language, which means that they view finance, economics, international law, and politics as one. They don't separate, on the one hand, politics or geopolitics, and on the other hand, financial and industrial and economic issues. For them, it's a unified playground. And they want the best for their countries. So, I'm sure that, President Xi Jinping wants the best for China, and I hope, and I think that in most instances, President Trump seems to want the best for America, and I think it's good. If people are selfish, in a certain way, it's good, but we have to realize that's how they operate, and we have to operate ourselves here in Europe, in Britain or Europe, on the same basis. We shouldn't be naive or excessively idealistic. We should take the world as it is, and that's what I mean by the age of geoeconomics.
Oh, perfect. And how do you think, we can build a better world once the crisis subsidizes?
Yeah, so I think really there is hope. So if I had two things to say today, so the first one was the sort of ultra-realist, cynical worldview, and it's really, to use another Greco-Roman word, it's a paradox, because on the one hand, you have a rise in Machiavellian cynicism or ultra-realism, and the paradox is at the same time, simultaneously, in parallel, you also have a rise in a certain form of idealism, certainly in the world of economics and finance, and it is really based to a large extent on the ESG mindset, the environmental, social governance triptych, and beyond the ESG mindset, on what we call here at the World Pensions Council, we call it, and I coined the term, and I'm very proud of it for what it's worth, we call it, the SDG-driven world economy.
I'm sorry, Nick, I'll just interrupt you here, but could you elaborate what SDG world economy basically is?
So the SDG-driven world economy, or SDG-driven investment, what does it mean? It's based on the United Nations SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and those were basically listed, if you will, by a bunch of very smart economists, policymakers, political scientists, development economists, many of them French, of course, and it was really fine-tuned and finalized in New York City at the UN 4 or 5 years ago. So really, they came of age 5 years ago at the UN, and they were called, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 of them. So it's a way of, slicing and dicing the world, and slicing and dicing the world economy into 17 cubes or 17 parameters or 17 issues. So if you come back to the slides that you just showed now with the 3 icons, if you can
just give me
bring back that slide. So the previous one, yep, that one here. So we at the World Pensions Council, we have selected 3 out of 17 icons, or 3 out of 17 sustainable development goals that we think are extremely important. And it means, we hope, and we believe that that's the future, when consumers, when investors, when policymakers, when sovereign funds, when ministers, when central banks, when governments, when any economic actor or financial investor does anything in life, each and every day, he will hopefully have these 3 parameters in mind, or 5 of the 17 sustainable development goals, or the whole 17. That's what we mean. And it's extremely important. It's extremely important to understand that why do they need to have that SDG-driven worldview? Because until now, there is a lot of short-termism built within the system, the whole system, the financial system, the economic system, the political system. And that financial short-termism is based to a large extent on terrible ideas that came not from the UN, not from New York City. They came from another American town, which is 1,000 miles west of New York, and it's called Chicago. And basically, in the early 1970s, that school of thought called the Chicago School, right? Mm-hmm. Their ideas progressively, slowly but surely, they started to spread. And they spread throughout the 70s. And then, in essence, in the late 70s, early 80s, they literally grabbed power. So in many ways, Margaret Thatcher in London and President Reagan in Washington, D.C. were agents of that Chicago school. So they came to power because behind them, there were ideologues and financiers who bankrolled the electoral campaigns of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and put them to power specifically to deploy a set of policy measures. And to make a long story short, these policy measures are very destructive. And one of the effects of that Chicago school extreme neoliberal, Thatcherite worldview is to believe that nature, the environment, is just an externality. So what does it mean, externality? It means if you are the CEO of a chemical company in Bhopal in India, and if your factory producing chemical in India or anywhere else in the world, if it throw away in the nearby river millions of liters of poison every day, and if down the river millions of Indian and Pakistani children will have cancer 5-10 years later, it is not your problem. It is an externality. Mm-hmm. That's really the deadly Chicago school worldview. Another horrible consequence of that Chicago school, Thatcher Reagan worldview was short-termism. So until the late 70s, the CEOs and the CFOs of listed companies in New York, London, Paris, Zurich, they had long-term plans. So if you're the CEO of a British company listed in London, your shareholders, many of them insurance companies and pension funds, they would understand that as a CEO of, let's say, US Steel or British Steel, you had a 10-15 years plan based on, strategic assumptions. And even though you had quarterly earnings, and even though you had meetings every quarter with the financial community in London or Wall Street, you wouldn't be harassed. So the CEOs were not harassed literally every month, every quarter by the analyst and aggressively asked to give them, a detailed assessment of what happened in the past 5 weeks, right? But everything's changed from the early 1980s onward, and the whole world became more and more short-termist. And so investors themselves demanded from the CEOs of these large listed companies to focus more on quarterly earnings. And so the system became rigged because the salaries of the CFOs and the CEOs, they became more and more attached to their quarterly financial performance. And the governments and the regulators were very happy about that. And MPs in London and Paris clapped their hand. Great, short-termism, it means modern, it means efficient. Of course not. It doesn't mean, short-termism doesn't mean modern and efficient. It's really stupid. But that mindset contaminated the whole world economy from the 1980s onward. And that's why we are now in the middle of that huge crisis. So really the roots of the crisis, they go deeper than, President Putin or His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman or an exotic virus that came from the province of Hubei in central China.
And what makes you so sure that the post-corona era will be so green, so much more caring and ethical? I mean, you've painted a rather bleak picture of the ages of geoeconomics and the cynicism of many policymakers to kind of exploit this circumstances into their own narrow national interest. So why the optimism?
Yeah, good question. And I'm aware of time, so I think it's good to conclude on a mildly optimistic note. Yes, I am mildly optimistic, and that's another slide that I used in the City of London at the TSAM conference 7 weeks ago. And yes, the reason why I'm optimistic is precisely because of the SDG-driven ethos. Mm-hmm. And that change of thinking, change of mindset, it started before the crisis. So here you have a picture of Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan. And it's a picture from the end of August, early September 2019. So really 7 months before the start of the crisis, right? Mm-hmm. And he's not only the CEO of JP Morgan, he's also the chairman of the Business Roundtable. And that is a very high level, fairly secretive association of blue-blooded CEOs of the largest American companies. So it's really the elite of the elite, the crème de la crème, as we say in French. And what's very interesting, you have a title here from the Financial Press from September 2019, Group of US Corporate Leaders Ditches Shareholder First Mantra. Mm-hmm. So the title is a little bit theatrical and exaggerated, but it conveys a good idea that even them, even the Business Roundtable, when they met for the annual meeting or conclave at the end of August 2019, they felt the urge to at least pretend that they were changing their behavior, which is great. So I'm not naive. I'm not saying, let's hug ourselves, let's hug the trees, and everyone now is a peacenik and a tree hugging, ecologist. But at least these ruthless capitalist CEOs of the largest, most efficient, most capitalist companies in the world, when they met in New York 7 months ago, they felt the need to at least go through the motions of pretending at least that things were changing, that they would have to change. Mm-hmm. And that they would have to stop focusing relentlessly only on short-term quarterly net profits. Now, it doesn't mean that they have to stop taking into account net profits. Of course, generating net profits should be one of the central objectives of each and every sane corporations. But my point is, when I say SDG-driven world economy, it should not kill other objectives. Mm-hmm. It should not destroy the environment. It should not transfer factories from California to Cambodia only because in Cambodia you can hire 12-year-old children and exploit them and have them work 7 days a week, 15 hours a day without a pension or without a healthcare plan. So that's what I mean by the SDG-driven ethos is, keep on as a CEO, as a corporate strategist, as a policymaker, as an MP, as a minister, keep on, building the economy, building your company in a way that makes it thrive, that makes it, in capacity to generate on a regular basis, strong, solid earnings, but don't do it at the expense of environmental, social, and governance parameters. So really both, to fly in the future, in the regenerated economic renaissance that I really believe could happen in the coming months, is, to fly, if you allow me to use the metaphor, that new bird will need two wings. So, keep one, capitalist, animal instinct, will to make money, mm-hmm. but add a second wing to find some kind of balance, and I think, that balance, the loss of balance that we have seen in the past 35, 40 years was very destructive. And I think we have to restore the balance. I'm not saying that we have to go back to Britain as it was in the year 1979, right? But I think we have to restore a new kind of balance
Mhm.
using these SDGs, incorporating these SDGs within the way we invest, within the way we analyze companies, within the way we speak with our employees, within the way we talk to investors. So if we make that change, I'm pretty much confident that the world economy can be rebuilt on much stronger, saner grounds, hopefully in the coming weeks when the lockdowns are over.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nick, for such an amazing discussion and ending it on a very positive high. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We had Nick Firzli joining us again today. Thank you. Until next time.
Merci.